Hi everyone. Um, just to say that you're all muted right now, just to keep the background noise down on the panelists. But please use the chat box to say hello, say where you're coming from, and if you've got any questions throughout the event, don't hesitate to ask. Just type it in. We'll come back to you when the time's right, and we'll maybe get a few people unmuted to ask their questions in person if they're comfortable to do that. And yeah, thank you very much for joining this Japanese book club event. It's great to be back at the Stay at Home Fringe Festival. And today we're going to be talking about writing Japan. So we've got a panel of excellent authors with us. A memoirist, a novelist, and an historian. The memoirist of our group is the University of Glasgow Creative Writing alum, IAIN Maloney. He's the author of the critically acclaimed The Only Gaijin in the Village. It's a memoir about his life in rural Japan. He's also published 3 novels and a collection of poetry, and in 2013, he was shortlisted for the Dundee International Book Prize. He's also a freelance editor and journalist, mainly for the Japan Times. Our novelist today is Nick Bradley. He's worked in a variety of jobs, including Japanese teacher, English teacher, video game translator, travel writer, lecturer, and photographer. He speaks fluent Japanese and has recently completed a PhD funded by the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation in creative and critical writing at the University of East Anglia. And he was focusing on the figure of the cat in Japanese literature, which is kind of appropriate because his novel and the BBC Radio 2 book club pick, The Cat in the City, is obviously centered around a cat, and it's a fantastic read. Our historian is Dr. Christopher Harding. He's a cultural historian of modern India and Japan, and he works as a lecturer in Asian history at the University of Edinburgh. His book, Japan Story, In Search of a Nation, 1850 to the Present, was a huge success. And in early November this year, just a couple of weeks, he is publishing a new book, The Japanese, A History in 20 Lives, which sets out to create a portrait of modern Japan through a biography of its people, a history distilled into the stories of 20 remarkable individuals. Yeah, and I think we'll just go straight ahead. As I said, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to just write them in the chat. But I think it might be appropriate to start by asking each of our panelists, can you give us some background as to your interest in Japan? What drew you to the country? What made you want to write about it? Nick, you seem to have found a real connection to its literature, or at least to the cat as a common literary symbol in Japanese writing. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that as well.
Okay, right. Well, thanks for having me, University of Glasgow, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. It's great to be on this panel with a couple of really interesting writers. So, how did I get interested in Japan? I think it all sort of started when I was at university, and I'd just done a master's degree in English literature. And back then, I used to be a medievalist, so I wrote my thesis on Chaucer. And I was thinking about doing a PhD, but my professor said to me that I was a bit young and that maybe I could go and see the world and do some things. And I'd always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a child. So I thought, well, I'll go somewhere different, or what I thought would be different. So yeah, I went out originally on jet, and I was based in rural Hiroshima. And I was just going there for 1 year. But I sort of fell in love with the language and the culture, and ended up staying there for 4 years on jet. And that was my path to becoming a translator. So then I went on to work for a few Japanese companies, and I ended up in Tokyo working for a Japanese travel agency. And I used to travel around the country and sort of take photos of tourist destinations and then come back to Tokyo and then make websites for different tourist boards and things. So yeah, that was my route into falling in love with Japan. I didn't plan it. It was kind of random. I just went somewhere different and sort of fell in love. Yeah, anyway, I'll let the others deal with that.
Ian, would you like to go ahead?
My interest in Japan started by moving to Japan. I kind of, in a way, ended up here a little bit by accident. As you mentioned at the start, I did the creative writing masters at Glasgow, and it turns out that while that's absolutely brilliant if you want to be a writer, in the job market in 2004, it wasn't the best thing to have. So I sort of graduated and really didn't know what I was going to do with myself. I had a very, very bad novel that was never going to get published and not much money. And it was actually my dad who said, well, why don't you go abroad and teach? Why don't you go to Japan? He was the one who was kind of big into Japan. He loved watching the Shogun series and things like that. And because I was staying with him rent free for the time, I went, yeah, okay, I'll apply for jobs in Japan. Just, don't cut me off, don't throw me out. And I got a job at Nova, who existed at the time, and came out here with the intention of staying for a year and then moving on probably to Korea or Vietnam or something like that. And I'm still here 15 years later. So yeah.
Yes. And Chris, would you like to tell us?
Yeah, it's a difficult question for me because I only have the very unfashionable answer of escapism to give you. Since I was very small, all these different forms of escapism that I indulged in turned out to be Japanese in origin. So the anime series, I was trying to remember the name. I think it was G-Force in the American version, which is Gatchaman in the original Japanese. There was that, and then there was all the tourist board stuff of lovely lush green paddy fields and Zen monasteries and all this kind of thing. And finally, when I was at university, undergraduate, we did this, the best job I've ever had, a month where Japanese university students came over to the UK. We taught them English, we toured them around the UK, and then we toured them around Europe. And they were just some of the most wonderful people I'd ever met. And they had fascinating technology, flippy mobile phones, which at the time was fascinating to me. And so I wanted to go and see where they came from. And I took a trip to Japan, and that was it really. That sort of got me hooked in.
Nice. Yeah, I think all of us here can relate to the escapism element of it, I think. Yeah, and I wonder, did any of you feel at all that writing about another country or culture has changed your views on the country, or did it open up something new within yourself even? Ian, did writing your memoir in any way help you to find your footing in rural Japan?
Yeah. Sorry.
No.
Yeah.
You go. Sorry.
It did to a certain extent, yeah, because writing the memoir, because it's writing about my own life, my own experience, it's sort of doing what Wordsworth described poetry as being, the emotion recollected in tranquility. It was going over experiences that had been kind of anecdotes that I'd tell my friends and things I'd talk about and maybe laugh about on Twitter or Facebook or something. And actually writing about it made me sit down and really think about kind of my motivations and my experiences going through those events, but also maybe what my neighbors were thinking or what my wife's family were thinking, and kind of analyze it in much greater depth and detail. And I think that definitely had that was definitely a large part of it. I think though, your main question, I think every writer, we write in order to learn, certainly I write in order to answer questions, things that I want to find out about. I mean, kind of superficial example, but my last novel, The Waves Burn Bright, I made the main character a geologist because at the time I was really into learning about geology and I wanted an excuse to buy more books about geology and learn more stuff about geology. And that made a big difference. But yeah, it definitely Just the very act of sitting down and thinking about things and then having to structure them and shape them and put them on a page definitely changed things. I don't know how the other guys feel.
Yeah, Nick, I'm wondering as well, so Ian chose the kind of memoir route to go into his love of Japan. I'm wondering, why did you choose fiction for that, for yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say, well, first of all, sort of that previous question about did writing about Japan change my opinion or my views on Japan? I don't think it did for me, because I think the vehicle of fiction is very much about setting up something different to yourself. So my book is not about me, and it's not about my ideas of Japan. It's more about trying to capture different voices or different perspectives of Japan. Or in my case, I think not so much Japan, but Tokyo in particular, because I think, you know, writing about Tokyo is a different beast to writing about rural Japan. But I would say, though, that my time in Japan, when I moved out there, like learning the language, I think that really affected my writing on a sentence level. I think that when I look back on stuff I wrote before I moved to Japan, I always think that the syntax was too like convoluted. My sentences were they were trying to do too much with language. And I think the act of studying Japanese and sort of starting again from zero and trying to learn to communicate with a very kind of simple vocabulary, which I had when I first moved there, I think that taught me something about how you could actually convey big ideas, but with very simple language. So I really am indebted to my time in Japan for teaching me how to write, if that makes sense. Did that answer the question? I'm not sure if I did or not.
I think it did very well. It's almost the opposite of Haruki Murakami. Then he looked to English to try and pare back all the Japanese kind of description and motive elements in the writing, and to find the rhythm.
Yeah, and definitely, like, I mean, I think I've talked to other people about this, but my characters, for me, they spoke in Japanese and I translated them into English. So, I mean, I would say that anytime there's narratorial voice, that's just sort of from scratch. But in my head, all my characters were speaking in Japanese. So I was trying to find a register of English that would suit the way that they were speaking in Japanese. So some of my characters speak with a more kind of British, sort of clipped, formal way of speaking. Some of them speak with a bit more of an American lilt. So yeah, I was definitely trying to do that with my characters, trying to represent them in English in the way that I heard them in my head in Japanese.
That's brilliant. That's interesting. And Chris, I suppose you had perhaps not a more intense, but you certainly had to delve into the past to write Japan Story and your new book, The Japanese. How did that kind of affect your views of the country?
It's an interesting one, because I managed to live in Japan on and off for quite a while without really understanding very much about what I was seeing around me. I think I'm probably distinct from Ian and Nick, I'm quite a bad traveller and quite a bad resident. I lived in Shimokitazawa, the neighbourhood in Tokyo, for a while, and everything around me, it felt very contemporary. And my grasp of what was going on around me was quite superficial. And I think I could have lived in Japan for years and years and years without really understanding where anything around me had its origins, where any of it came from, apart from a vague idea that Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples are fairly old. And lots of the built environment in Tokyo, of course, was destroyed in the war. So you don't get the sense, always walking around a place like Tokyo, of history shouting at you, so you have to kind of go looking for it. So I found actually going back and forward between being in Japan and going away and reading about it and researching the history and then looking at Japan afresh with those eyes, you notice things. So I think it helped me to appreciate being in Japan more, having gone away and found out how everything got there. I mean, to an extent, my book isn't quite that comprehensive, but I think that's my approach. Otherwise, I'm not the kind of person who notices things. I would be a very, very bad travel writer. So instead, my approach is to go away and do some reading and then try and structure it so that it makes sense to me, and then hopefully it makes sense to other people as a result. I would say that's my approach, yeah.
I suppose, Chris, as well, how did you manage to communicate Japan in your writings, Japanese stories to an English audience? And each of you, to a degree, we all bring a degree of universality to the topic or the Japanese setting. Nick, your stories are emotive and relatable. Ian, we adjust through your Western eyes. But Chris, you in particular must have thought long and hard about how to engage the reader, because you're quite directly educating us on another culture. Did that, by putting a particular focus on individuals, especially in the upcoming book Japanese, was that a way of trying to find a way of carrying Japanese history's appeal?
Yeah, I suppose because I trained in first Indian history and then Japanese history, to put it bluntly, that these are both places where there's a kind of modern history of white middle class people going out and telling people how things are, and perhaps not always being very sensitive about the place they're dealing with. That's not the position we're in now, but I mean, think back to perhaps the Victorian era, early Edwardian era, a lot of travel writers perhaps not taking the most sensitive tack. So one of the things I wanted to do, I think an outsider view on a place can be very useful. Wouldn't buy into the idea that you can't possibly write about a place if you don't come from there. But I wanted to try to show people what the country looked like from a combination of my point of view as a historian, but also the point of view of people who were in that place at that time and how their lives were being affected by what was going on. So to give just one very brief example, in the Japanese, the book that's coming out shortly, one of the 20 is Shibusawa Eiichi, the so-called father of Japanese capitalism. And he's great because he's growing up. He's a young man at the time of the Commodore Perry, the Americans coming to Japan in the 1850s. All these big questions about how Japan is going to open up to the world and what they're going to do and whether you need to get rid of the old leadership or not. And he's fascinating because he ends up first taking up arms, collecting some weapons. He wants to go and fight the Westerners. Then he goes to Paris and learns about European Western technology. Then he comes back and he starts to pioneer banking systems and factories and all the rest. So in a single life, you can get both a person's reaction to the world around them. They sort of parachute you directly into that place and time. And at the same time, you can smuggle in all these elements of the history that I want to try to communicate to people. So you get to do both. You can try to be faithful to the time and place via a particular person. And you can also, as I say, smuggle things in, which if you put them in cold historical terms, in the end, people might start to perhaps get a little bit bored. You can have, I suppose you can have legitimate drama without making things up, which as a historian, you're not really supposed to do. So you try and get the best of both worlds, I suppose, that way.
And anyone else? Ian, how do you feel about trying to communicate Japan in your writing?
I don't know. I mean, for me, I don't know if I am trying to communicate Japan in a certain sense, because it's a memoir. I'm sort of just directly communicating my own experience. I think you said in your question, it's like the readers are looking through my eyes and experiencing it. So it's, from a writing point of view, it's very route one. It's Dante being guided into hell and shown things. It's me standing here going, I don't understand what's going on. Someone please explain it to me, and slowly learning. So people, the readers learn as I learn what's going on. What I find really interesting, just to flip it slightly onto Nick, is that Nick, in your book, with the exception, I think, of one character, all of them, the first-person narrators, are Japanese characters. I think Flo's the only one who isn't. And you said you heard them speaking to you in Japanese in your head. How did you find the experience of writing all those characters, all those Japanese characters? Because not to cast aspersion on yours, I've read other books by non-Japanese writers who've tried to do narration, first-person narration from a Japanese character. It hasn't always worked out very, very well, but you do it excellently. How was it?
Wow, yeah, that's a really tough question. Oh, first of all, I wanted to say I love your Pearl Jam t-shirt. I'm a big fan of Pearl Jam. Yeah. So I think it's difficult, isn't it? One of the things that I really loved about doing my PhD in Japanese studies, not Japanese studies hardcore, but I was part of the Japan studies research community. One of the things that I kind of learned in the UK and in Europe when I went to conferences and things was that people were constantly reinforcing the idea that, look, Japan is not unique. You know, it's often depicted as being unique, and people like to look at the differences between Japan and the rest of the world. But actually, there are so many similarities. And I think that hearing so many academics saying that actually really kind of frees you up when you start writing, because you think, well, of course, you know, everyone comes from different backgrounds. But I mean, for example, like say Norwich, I'm not born in Norwich, but there are tons of people around me who grew up in Norwich. But I could go around the city centre doing a kind of questionnaire and asking people about their lives and how, you know, what Norwich was like for them. And I would come back with millions of different answers, because everything is a kind of a subjective lived experience. And so I think one of the keys to tapping into writing about anyone is just thinking about like what we have in common and how would that feel. And I think that that's one thing that fiction does, is it tries to empathize. You try to look into, say, for example, I mean, one of my characters is like shocking. He's terrible. He's a psychopath. And that's one thing that memoirs don't do so much. They don't tend to show you know, the psychopath, because perhaps the psychopath doesn't want to be honest about their true feelings. But I think, you know, when writing fiction, you can start to think, well, how would a psychopath think? You know, how might I depict that? And I think that that's what fiction is it's asking the reader to sort of believe in magic a little bit. It's asking them to suspend their disbelief and just sort of buy into this thing that's not real. But you're trying, as a writer, you're trying to create this illusion that it is real. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think when writing about Japanese people, I think, well, it's no different to writing about women. I don't approach writing women to a different, you know, it's a different, that's not a different experience for me writing about a woman as it is to writing about a man. I think you approach it in the same way. You think, what does this person want? They're human, they have desires. You know, they want things, they want their life to take a certain trajectory. And I think I do that with all characters. I think I look at them all the same. As a species, we're all human, we all need things. I know obviously like there'll probably be disagreement with what I'm saying, but I think that's how I approach writing, yeah.
I just want to say not all memoirists are psychopaths. Yeah, no, it's really interesting what you're saying that, because reading it, you were talking about the characters speak Japanese in your head, and you tried to translate it and use different voices and things like that. But it really came across on the page. I was reading it because it's something I've come across myself in writing before, is people going, oh, but I wrote a book set in the Second World War, and a few readers were like, oh, they sound very modern, the language is very modern. And reading yours, I was like, the language the characters talking is sometimes it's very British, sometimes it's very American. It's got that kind of, there's a slang quality and a natural quality, but it works perfectly because it is natural, and it is kind of, if you could translate it, that's kind of how it would sound like. But so many fiction writers in writing about Japan try to replicate Japanese in English, and it really doesn't work most of the time. And you didn't do that, which I was curious about your process. So
yeah, that's a really good observation. I think it kind of ties into the discussion with historical fiction too. You know, writers who try to write this authentic language of the time, which would be quite difficult for modern readers, or people who say, right, I'm going to update that, I'm going to try and just take the spirit of it. And I think from working as a translator too, there's that debate in translation, the sliding scale of creative versus literal. And I think I think this is also where it comes down to readers' tastes or an artist's tastes. Some people like that idea of authenticity and literal translation, and some people like, you know, just being able to relate to the emotions or the spirit behind things. What Walter Benjamin called the pure language behind things. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm hijacking this off you, Reese, but Chris, how do you feel about it? Because Chris, in Japan's story, you get into psychology quite a lot. The kind of what people were thinking in history, either individually or sort of collectively. And I'm assuming, I haven't obviously read your new book because it's not out yet, but I'm assuming because it's based on lives that you really do dig into that. How did you find that side of things?
It's always a tricky one because I find that when you're writing about these characters, you build up a picture of what they are like, certainly what they've done, and to some extent what their inner life is like if they left their own memoir, diaries, letters, whatever it might be. But then there's always the temptation to, or almost not even a temptation, almost automatically to start filling in gaps. You know, if I've got a character who behaved in this way at one point, I said, well, she was probably then thinking that or planning to do that later on. Then you have to go back to the material and say, is that actually true? Do I actually have any kind of grounding for that? Because I want to try to produce the history in a way that's dramatic and engaging, but still firmly rooted in what I can certainly know. I think the other issue for historians when we focus on lives like this, actually my editor said this at Penguin, he said, be really careful you don't end up using any one person as a cipher. In other words, you know, so it would be very convenient if you're trying to distill a country's history into 20 lives, if some of those 20 people do particular things or thought particular things or usefully represent something that was, you know, maybe the zeitgeist. Often people are inconvenient and they don't. And you have to be honest about that. Otherwise you are abusing a person's life and you are straying. I mean, I sometimes think one day to do some kind of historical fiction would be nice, but I think I've always got to be careful of the genre that I'm actually in. Otherwise you can start to write something that might be quite engaging, but it's one of those things, if you start to lose trust in the person you're hearing from, then at some point you're going to put down the book. You know, if you don't think you can believe them, if they've made one too many mistakes early on, you think, actually, that's me, I'm going to go and find a more reliable historian of Japan. So the temptation to sort of slightly fabricate these people is always there, and that's what the editing process goes about, going back and thinking, actually, do I know she said that? Do I know she thought that? So hopefully people can rely on the final product, fingers crossed.
Chris, just to read a bit of your book back to you, you've got a great bit very early on where you say, a good story offers purchase on life, and though a story may give shape to a single life or nation, it risks doing so at the cost of a steady loss of the ability to see, think, and imagine otherwise about oneself or one's home. I think, does that kind of tie into what you're saying as well, a little bit?
I think so. I think it also ties into something that Nick was saying, and I was really glad to hear you saying it, Nick, that writing about Japan from a Japanese point of view, you begin with what you have in common. Because I think when I started writing about Japan, Japanese friends of mine would say, you'll never get a job in Japan teaching Japanese history, being a foreigner. There was still a pervasive view, and I think Ian and Nick will know better than me, you've spent more time there recently than I have. The extent to which this may or may not still be true, the idea of a foreigner likely having their own particular take on Japanese history, or missing something about Japanese history. There was this idea, and I think it was prevalent into the 1990s in Japan, that you know, the whole Nihon Jinron idea that there is something sort of special and unique about Japan, and that you can't legitimately understand Japan or criticize Japan unless you are sort of, as it were, part of the club. And that's one of the stories that I had in mind, Reese, to go back to that quote, the idea that Japan is special and different, and then it goes down to the level of sort of psychology, I mean, even biology and nutrition and climate, some people would love to claim. It's those kinds of stories that I think can have that really limiting effect. And so the more that we can try to get round and recognize the diversity of Japan as a place, we've been talking about that, and also recognize the idea that with the appropriate humility, people from outside Japan have a lot to contribute in terms of understanding the place and sharing some of what's interesting about it. I hope, I mean, I wonder what Ian and Nick would say to that. I hope we're not perhaps in that place anymore where there is that sense of not having legitimate things to say about Japan if you don't have 3 or 4 generations in the graveyard, as it were. Perhaps we've moved on from that, or perhaps you two have bumped up against it.
Can I answer that with a question, Chris? Are either of your books going to be translated into Japanese?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, we had, this would be a story in itself. We had a back and forth with a couple of publishers on Japan Story. One really interesting thing came back. They said, we like the book, but people in Japan at the moment are feeling, for want of a better expression, a bit down in the dumps about Japan's prospects. And they want a book, basically, they want a history of Japan that is a fanfare of the country's achievements and fascinating future prospects. Whereas Japan Story, part of what it tries to do is give that narrative, but also the darker side. People who've questioned it, people who want to reshape what Japan is all about, they said actually what that adds up to for potential readership is yet more bashing of Japan by outsiders. And thanks very much, but we're not short of Japan bashing books written by outsiders. So yeah, there's a struggle there.
Yeah, well, because that's where I've encountered it. Like you're saying that, yeah, things have changed and stuff, but in publishing in Japan, in my experience, it is still there. And yeah, we have enough history books about Japan, or we have enough stories about what it's like living in Japan. We don't need to translate your ones. We have those. There's been a bit of pushback there. How about you?
My wife had a good. She's from Okayama and she's a bibliophile. She knows her Japanese publishing industry quite well. She said the only way you could really sell a book like that would be explicitly, this is a Westerner's view of Japan. If you're interested in what a Westerner might think about Japan, then buy this book. It can't possibly be marketed as superior in sort of purely intellectual or objective terms to what a Japanese person might come up with. Yeah, maybe she's right. Maybe we'll try that.
Yeah. I was told you have to achieve bestseller status in the United States and then they'll consider it. So
that sounds familiar as well. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Ian, you make just on this point of the outsider, you say in the Only Gaijin in the Village that you're not an expat, and that's kind of an important shift in perspective, I think, that you're an immigrant, a Gaijin, and it's not Japan that's kind of foreign and strange in your story. It's you that's kind of foreign and strange. But can you tell us a bit more? You're welcome. But can you tell us a bit more kind of about this distinction and about how it affected your writing?
Part of it is just a linguistic point that when the word expat is used, it's usually used to differentiate between good immigrants and bad immigrants. It's an aspect of white privilege to a certain extent of expats are good, immigrants are people we should be trying to keep out of the country, and that really annoys me. That linguistic difference has always annoyed me, not just in Japan. So I don't like the word and I refuse to use it. And yeah, that's kind of what started there. But it also writing about my experiences, writing about living in Japan. For a start, it was something I didn't particularly want to do in the first place. There's a lot of very, very bad books out there about, hey, I'm a foreigner living in Japan, and either it's I'm 23 years old and I've just come to Japan and isn't Tokyo crazy and there's karaoke and kanji and sushi and isn't it mad? Or there's a subgenre of foreigners complaining about Japan and here's what I don't like and here's what's wrong and here's what's wrong. And I didn't want to do either of those things. So for a long time, I didn't want to write about it. And when I finally, long story short, when I finally decided I was going to do a book, one of the things I wanted to do was stay as far as I could away from the idea of I didn't want my privilege to show, I suppose, in a certain way. I'm British, which in Japan I've got a British passport. I've been in immigration centres where people have, like the staff have tried to get me to skip the queue because I've got a British passport, so that's easier to deal with. There's less problems, stuff like that. I'm middle class, I'm white, I'm male, I'm straight. I've got all these privileges, and the last thing I wanted was to write a book where either I was just going on about, isn't it great living in Japan, because it's easier for me to live in Japan than it is for a guy from Vietnam who works in the convenience store, or a factory worker from South America in Toyota working in the factories there. I wanted to kind of acknowledge that and include that and embrace that in a way. So part of what I wanted to do before I even set out in the book is to just deflate that idea of there are expats, there are immigrants, there's me, and there's the guy from Vietnam working in the convenience store. Whether or not I did it is something that other readers can work out for themselves. But yeah, that's sort of why I declare war on the word expat in my book. But it's also, there's also a status thing when we're writing, and part of this, like Chris was talking about, the outsider writing about Japanese history and having that perspective, which is a valid perspective, but is an outsider's perspective. There's a thing I've learned a bizarre amount about writing and also about teaching from listening to podcasts about stand-up comedy. Particularly Stuart Goldsmith's Comedian's Comedian podcast, which I recommend to everyone. Stand-up comedians talk a lot about status. When you're on stage doing a stand-up comedy set, you have a status. So if you're a comedian like Jimmy Carr, you're a high status comedian, you're rich, you're successful. So his performance, he can be kind of haughty and condescending. Or you can have a low status comedian, somebody like, I don't know, like Joe Wilkinson, or somebody who's kind of a bit of a mess and a bit, the audience can sort of look down on him to a certain extent. And I think certainly with my book, if I had been high status in the book, it wouldn't have worked. I'd have come across as a condescending prick. Just, right, here's all the things that I don't like about Japan, and here's some funny stories where I come out as the good guy. Would never work. Nobody would want to read that, and I wouldn't want to write that, and I wouldn't want anyone in the world to ever think that I was that kind of person. So to write the book, for that book to ever work, I have to be lower status in a sense. So like it's a funny book. There's a lot of humor, but it's all self-deprecating. I'm always the one who comes out of situations worse. Yeah, so I don't know, I'm drifting off the subject to a certain extent. But yeah, I think all of that is just, I'm aware with the conversations going on in the world around us and just now, I'm aware of the privilege and the status of me in real life, but also on the page, and that factors in massively into how I wrote that book.
Yeah, for anyone that hasn't read it, The Only Gaijin in the Village is brilliantly funny. Actually, it's great, and it's good to hear the origin of that, the hours and hours on comedians' podcasts and stuff.
For Goldsmith, there you
go. Nick, just there, Chris was talking about warning about distilling a country into people's lives. But in the first story, I think, in your book, The Cat in the City, you distill the entire of Tokyo onto the back of one of your characters. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that. Why did you go for that image?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a good question. Why did I go for that image? Like, several reasons. One was just that the act of writing about a city was proving really tough, like really difficult, and just this, symphony of voices, the symphony of people, was starting to blow my mind a little. So I like the idea of the artist, the tattoo artist, sort of going mad in this attempt to try and depict the city on the back of someone. There are also a couple of other reasons. One was that there's a short story by one of my favorite writers, Tanizaki, which is translated in different different titles. It's sometimes the tattooer, it's sometimes tattooer, tattooist, or whatever. But that story I used as a kind of base. So it's a similar setup. It's a tattoo artist who becomes obsessed with a girl and wants to tattoo something on her back. But in that case, it's a spider, so it's a slightly different story. I'm also a big fan of science fiction, and I really love Ray Bradbury's collection of stories called The Illustrated Man, which is also a similar concept of tattoos being stories. Yeah, so that's why I went for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have Tokyo tattooed on your back, Nick?
No, I don't. I would never ever get a tattoo. You know, I would. I mean, I change my opinions on things all the time. So I think I would get one, and then a week later I'd be like, what have I done?
And you can't go in the onsen in Japan. That's why I have no tattoos. I love the onsen too much.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful way to kind of set up the story, just to zoom in the city though. There's this tattooist agonizing over this piece of work. And there's a lot of kind of, you put a lot of magic into you tie magic into the traditional, the kind of lost art. I was wondering was that deliberate? Did you really want to explore traditional Japan in quite a modern book as well?
Yeah, one of the weird things is that I see this word popping up a lot now, magical realism, describing my book. But the weird thing is that I'm like from a family, I'm like the black sheep in my family. So all my family are scientists, they're all doctors, engineers, dentists. And I was, at the age of 18, I had to sort of stick up to my parents and say, no, I'm not going to go study dentistry. I want to be a writer. I want to study English literature, which I don't know why I did that. But I come from a very rational, logical background. And really the book for me, I tried to write a book that was scientifically logical and that there was an explanation for everything. But it's really lovely to see how the readers have brought to life this magic in the book that really, like, I didn't intend to write into it. I intended for it to be very, very much grounded in realism. But yeah, so that I'm kind of pleasantly happy that people have seen a magic side to things. Yeah.
To be fair, it does start off with a magic cat. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. But the idea was always that it could be in his head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're saying your family are all scientists, and one of your characters is a bit of a mad scientist. That's how did that go down?
Well, yeah. So Bob the robot in that story, he's based on my older brother. Who's just his company have just printed the first 3D printed drivable vehicle in Europe. So yeah, Bob was the inspiration behind the 3D printing. Yeah.
Cool.
Chris, you've kind of, just to change the subject quite drastically from magical realism, that may or may not be there. Chris, you've touched in your book about, or just in the past and on podcasts and things, and you've touched about how modern Japan has strived forward as a united country. But while it might be one country, it's not one race. Can you talk a bit more about that and how you've thought about dealing with this diversity in your writing?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's strange for someone of my generation who grew up on. I used to really love Clive James's travelogues. I don't know if people have seen his work on Japan, and then Jonathan Ross did his Japan series, and all these kind of pop culture explorations of Japan do kind of have in the background this idea that there is to some extent at least, a kind of psychological unity of people in Japan. Often they're only talking about cities and certain demographics, but the underlying idea was often of a certain kind of similarity, that people will have the same parameters of behavior, see the world in a similar kind of way. And although that's maybe a social or a cultural idea, the idea has been really popular in Japan, certainly in the modern era, that is also linked to a homogeneity of race, and that we certainly have very little to do with the rest of Asia. One of the things that the Japanese have been keen to do at various points in the past is make clear distinctions between Japan and China, or Japan and Korean Peninsula, or Southeast Asia, etc. And you can find that being pushed. There's a quote, I think, either in Japan Story or the new book. You can find Japanese politicians of this generation still saying we are one culture, one language, one race, one nation. And that is still, I encounter that a lot working in Japan. That is still quite a popular idea, whereas it's been hinted at already in our conversation. I think Nick was saying, going to meeting academics who work on Japan, one thing that gets said over and over again is that there is enormous diversity, yet in terms of race, in terms of neighborhood, in terms of region, attitudes. Japan has class. If you only encounter Japan through a lot of the pop culture product of the West, you wouldn't get the impression that there are different classes in Japan. I remember the first time I saw a district of Okayama, I think it was, that was obviously quite a rundown part of the city. I thought, this doesn't really look like the Japan that I've grown up imagining. And it can be quite a surprise. So I suppose I wanted to get that sense in the book of an enormous diversity of experience, and also diversity of what people in Japan would like the word Japan to mean, what they want the associations to be for their country. Because often the people that lead that are people at the top of politics, or people at the top of media, or the tourist board, who want to project a certain image of Japan abroad. And the reality is that there's a real fight going on in the background, certainly in the modern era, which is what I study, for people who want Japan to take a very different tack. So the idea, and that's what I suppose looking at people allows you to do, you can look at those sorts of fights over identity, which isn't something that we often associate Japan with. I mean, one of the reasons, perhaps when you were asking earlier on about why I got interested in Japan, one of the really boring things about Japan, I think, when I was learning about it, was its politics. I think if you're really into Japan's politics, you can probably find lots to enjoy there. But that lack of a kind of a regular, a reasonably balanced back and forth across an ideological spectrum isn't something that we often associate with Japan. It's the Liberal Democratic Party and its various fringe rivals who keep breaking up and reforming to try and have a better stab at fighting the LDP. So for all these reasons, there isn't often in our general understanding of Japan an impression of great diversity, an impression of great contest ideologically over politics. And I wanted the book to try to say to readers, actually, that's not quite true. There's a lot going on in the background that doesn't always filter through, but that's worth understanding. I hope that makes sense as a slightly long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully that more or less comes together as a response.
No, that was great, thank you. And if anybody else wants to ask a question, we're coming into the last 10 minutes. Feel free, again, just pop them in the chat. But to continue on this kind of topic of overlooked stories in a way, Nick, you deal quite directly with homelessness in Japan, including in relation to the Tokyo Olympics. Earlier this year, the Japanese Book Club, who welcomed the translator of Yu Murray's Tokyo Ueno Station, which also deals a lot with the Olympics and homelessness. And there's been quite a bit of journalism surrounding this topic too recently. But I wondered why in particular did you want to broach this topic in your writing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it kind of ties a bit in with what Ian and Chris have been saying too. Particularly when Ian was talking about expats and immigrants, and what Chris was also just talking about Japan and othering. So I think, yeah, one of the things I wanted to do with my book was to take this idea of harmony that's often depicted in Japanese culture and say, well, I know that Japan likes harmony, it likes accord, it likes everyone saying and thinking the same thing. But I know from my experiences living there, when I go to parties and people get drunk and they start to talk to me candidly, that people don't necessarily all agree with each other, and there are lots of differing opinions. But I think that this kind of human instinct to create an us and them, and in Japanese they would say uchi and soto, it comes from that. And I always wanted to write a book about people who didn't quite fit in to the status quo, to what was accepted in Japan. And I started writing, I mean, I wrote the story about the homeless guy, Ohashi. I wrote that back in 2016. So this is 4 years before the Olympics was going to happen. And the reason I started to write that story was because I started to think about the city changing. So I wanted the city to change like a character. And I thought that a good way of looking at a changing city was to look at the lead up to the Olympics. So, and I started to do research on the Olympics in all cities in previous years. And there's a common trend that before the Olympics, people do take the homeless out of the CBDs. They do try to clean up the city. And this also, I mean, this was cut from the book, but also there was, in previous Olympic cities, there was also the rounding up of stray dogs and cats and the euthanizing of those stray animals. So I kind of wanted to write about like the dark underside of the Olympics, and maybe the things that don't get noticed so much and don't get commented on so much, because we're thinking more about this great union of all these different countries coming together. And in response to the Tokyo Ueno Station by Yumiri, which I have a copy of here because I thought you were going to ask that question. So when I found out about this book, I was kind of scared. I was like, oh gosh, we've written about the same thing. So I purposefully didn't read it until after my book had been published. And then I read it and I thought, well, actually, I'm really pleased that we both picked up on something. And it's no kind of coincidence that Yumiri herself is a Zainichi Korean writer. So she's part outsider herself. You know, she's grown up in Japan, her first language is Japanese, but she has this identity that puts her slightly out of the accepted norm. So I was actually, I mean, I think her book is a bit different to mine. I think hers is better in a lot of ways in how it examines this one issue. But I was also kind of pleasantly, I don't know, it was one of those moments where I thought, oh, that I'm pleased that I picked up on something there that actually, you know, coincided with another writer's thoughts. Yeah. Oh, it's called Tokyo Ueno Station. So it's Ueno is one of the stations in the north part of Tokyo called, so it's UENO, Ueno.
Nick, sorry, can I just cut in? Nick, I wanted to ask, did the cancelling of the Olympics force any rewrites?
Oh, absolutely not. No, because it had already gone to press. It was there sitting.
Because towards the end of the book, it gets very, very close to saying like the Olympics are taking place. It's actually happening.
Yeah.
Just
no, that was just an awful time in early lockdown when my editor was saying, "Oh God, they're going to cancel the Olympics," and I was just like, "It doesn't matter. It's fine."
And there's a question for Chris in the chat here. Nadine, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask it yourself if you can unmute.
Thank you. Well, I would have a question for each of the writers, and thank you, because it is very interesting conversation, but I know we don't have much time. And as I am myself a historian of modern Japan, I thought I would ask Chris a question. In spite of the appearances, I wrote my PhD not that long ago, but when I started this PhD, I was told, oh, biographies, no, that's not really interesting. Nobody does that anymore. And I see that with your new book, you have, and I have myself written about one particular character, but I see that you've chosen to do this, to write about several people. And I'm wondering what you think about this idea of biography being a little bit passé or no longer useful, and whether you think you're contributing something different, something else by writing a biography, and what is it?
Good question. Yeah, I think I received similar advice when I was applying for research money, is that no one does biography anymore, you know, at a proper kind of academic level. I think especially if you can have a cast of characters, if it's a multi-part biography, I think there's something rich about that. But also there are few ways of getting into a place as rich and promising and dramatic as through individual lives. There's that immediate connection. I mean, you see it in Ian's work and in Nick's work as well, from their different points of view, to get in there via people's lives, I think is a wonderful way to do things, to explore, and also as a historian trying to communicate with quite a broad audience. You can smuggle in some of the stuff that in an academic book can weigh it down in terms of its architecture, you know, theoretical approaches, arguments against this or against that. You can communicate all that in the context of exploring someone's life, but not in a way that hopefully will end up with people just putting the book down and walking off in disgust. So I think biography offers you a chance to do so much if it's handled well. If it's simply a mini Wikipedia entry, someone's life, birth to death, then I could see that can be quite uninteresting intellectually. But I think if the possibilities are used well, then I think it's a wonderful way of immersing people as directly as possible into a time and place without being too laborious about your setup.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Chris, you do that very well yourself. When in Japan's story, I love the fact that every single chapter, it starts with this biographical moment. There's like a nice story about somebody that's some situation or some character that embodies what you're then going to go on to talk about, and you bring the reader in that way. It's a really nice way of structuring things.
Oh, thank you. That's kind of you to say. You always wonder if you think in the end people will feel like I'm indulging myself a little bit too much. But thank you, and that's really kind of you too.
It works well.
I've got one quick question for Ian just before. I think we'll end on Rona's question. It's a great one to end on. But just talking about biographies, why you said early on you wrote novels about topics you really wanted to learn more about. Why didn't you write a novel about a gaijin in Japan? Why did you go for the memoir?
Because I tried to, is the short answer. I tried a couple of times to write, to take these stories, the kind of my experiences, and turn it into a novel. And about 30,000 words in, I realized all I was doing was just masking my own experiences and sort of semi-fictionalizing them, and eventually just went, this is a waste of time. I could just write the actual, like, the story is the thing that's interesting, not how it's framed. So I'll just tell the actual story. And that's what started it. It started as a column on Gaijin Pot, and it was just me taking these stories and going, does this actually just work as a story without me inventing characters and situations? And like I had a whole idea about this. An Irish guy, not a Scottish guy, he's Irish and he's moved to Japan, and it was just like, God, it's so thinly veiled and crap. But that's the main reason. I wrote one novel entirely set in Japan with Japanese characters, and I showed it to my agent and a couple of publishers, and they all went, oh God, no, we're not publishing that. It's very, very weird. It's unstructured, and sort of that it is magical realism. We're talking about that earlier. It's a magical realist mess, and everybody who read it went, yeah, well done, we're not publishing that. So we went with Memoir in the end.
So just to go to Rona's question to finish things up, how would each person suggest beginning to get to know Japan from afar? She's very fascinated by it, but is yet able to go.
Read our books. Is the short version.
Yeah, I would be really, really biased, and I would say read lots of Japanese literature. But that's because that's where my interest lies. You know, I love fiction, I love literature. So for me, but then there's tons of really good non-fiction about Japan too. But I think if you want to write, I think the key to any kind of writing, be it historical writing, memoir, or fiction, I think the key is to read lots and lots and lots. And I would just say there's such a rich literary history in Japan. There's so many amazing writers. So I would suggest, yeah, just devour as much literature as you can.
I had a couple of suggestions to complement that. Hopefully, we are bringing up our children to speak Japanese, and we make heavy use of sites like, I think, Drama Crazy or something like that. Japan does contemporary drama I think, very well. It can sometimes be a bit cheesy and contrived. And some of these websites, be very careful because you get some very, very odd pop-up advertising on it. But as a compliment to the literature, which is sometimes from the kind of the purer end of literature, something perhaps a bit more, not that literature can't be down to earth, but certainly some of this contemporary drama in Japan is a lovely way of getting straight into the country. You get the diversity and you get the humour that way. So a lot of that you can find out there online with reasonably good subtitles. Also historical drama, Japan I think does really well. And again, you can find that for free online with subtitles, just careful of the pop-ups. That'd be my tip, I think.
Okay, great. And Nadine has also put to Rona to read Roland Barthes' The Empire of the Signs.
Good job.
Oh, I didn't like that.
Are there any writers out there that do like Roland Barthes? I've fought with him on a number of occasions.
What would be your suggestion, Ian, for getting into Japan?
Apart from my flippant one at the start, yeah, I agree with all of that. I read the literature, read the history. George Samson, I'm forgetting his name. Chris, you're the historian. George Samson's trilogy of history books about Japan are what I started with, and they get dry in places, but they're generally very, very good. And I hope Chris is not now about to say that they're all being debunked or anything like that. Yeah, they're good books. Things like the Ghibli films, Miyazaki Hayao films are great because they show a certain viewpoint that is popular in Japan. You know, they're Japanese films that are popular here and are popular outside Japan and can give a certain access into values and society and things like that. I thought the recent series Giri Haji on BBC and Netflix, that was very, very good, very nice. When Chris was talking earlier about Japanese identity and their relationship with China and sort of mainland Asia, I couldn't help thinking about the similarities between two island nations who have slightly problematic relationships with the continent nearby, and Giri Haji is a very, very good embodiment of that similarity. So yeah.
I know we're out of time, I don't want to be too long, but the last thing I might add is to, as far as possible, go for breadth. There are so many different angles that you could take on Japan that are out there, you know, from literature, film, drama, cuisine, meeting people, sport, all the rest of it. Don't get stuck on just one. I think try and get a sense of that breadth. That's what's so fascinating. It's endlessly broad, and there's so much out there available now. So as far as possible, yeah, I would try and get yourself a good breadth and make your own decisions about what Japan is like as a place.
Let's start with our books.
And start with our books, yes, please. Yeah, 2 or 3 copies apiece.
Yeah. So just to wrap things up, thank you so much to all our attendees. Thank you to the Stay at Home Fringe Literary Festival for hosting us again. And thank you, of course, to our panelists. And just to echo Ian again, do read Ian's The Only Gaijin in the Village. Do read Nick Bradley's The Cat in the City. And do read Chris Harding's Japan Story and the upcoming The Japanese, A History in 20 Lines. Yeah, and thank you so much. This has been recorded, so I'll put it up on the Japanese Book Club YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel, and I'll tweet about that later on. So you can all access this again, share with your friends, stuff like that. But thank you again so much to everybody, to our panelists and attendees. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you, Reese, for organising and hosting it.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining as well. Cheers.
Take care, everybody.
Yeah. Bye-bye.